Good evening, everybody. I'd just like to welcome you all to this evening's event. I'm Rosemary Dean. I'm Vice Principal Education here at Royal Holloway. And I just want to say a few words about this ESRC Festival of Social Science, Who's NHS debate. First of all, we're very grateful to the Economic and Social Research Council for funding this event, but also particular thanks to Mark Exworthy in the School of Management and Oliver Heath from Politics and International Relations, who made the original application to the SRC. Also, the Centre for Social Sciences at Royal Holloway for hosting the event, and Marta Baker and Sue Heath for making tonight's arrangements. So how did it come about? I think the history of our involvement in health at Royal Holloway, both in the social sciences and in other disciplines, shows that you can actually be involved in health research and teaching without a medical school on site. Some of you know, perhaps, that we did try to merge with the medical school, but for various reasons that didn't come off. But we have been involved in a lot of collaboration. We had something called SWAN, the South West Academic Network, which is between Kingston and St George's and ourselves, which looked at biomedical sciences, the Interprofessional Institute, and also leadership and management and health. And some of those things are still ongoing. And we now have a cross-college research theme, which is on health, bodies and behaviour. So we're trying to keep that kind of development of health topics, whether they go, whatever discipline they go, so it could be social science, it could be arts and humanities, it could be sciences, actually trying to sustain those things. And we have quite a lot of research in the faculties of science and management and economics on health, and we also have social work in arts and social sciences. And we have a whole range of health-related programmes, from the doctorate in clinical psychology to biomedical sciences, which is a BSc, and also an MSc in social work. Now, so far as this particular research theme and how it relates to the Economic and Social Research Council, the research councils as a whole in the UK have a theme which is called Lifelong Health and Wellbeing, which is the subtitle of which is Realising Economic, Social and Health Gains of Healthy Ageing whilst Reducing Dependency Costs and Inequities Later in Life. It sounds a bit like a dictionary definition, doesn't it? Something out of Wikipedia, but anyway, I'm sure it's all great stuff. And the SRC itself doesn't have a specific theme around health, but it does have two themes which I think can embrace health-related research: a vibrant and fair society, because clearly health is crucial to that, and health inequalities, as we've known for a long time, right back to the Black Report, are one of the areas where inequality is extremely visible. And the second one is influencing behaviour and informing interventions, and again one can see how that might apply to health. And of course, the National Health Service is of concern to everyone in the UK, though obviously it's changed an awful lot since its inception in 1948, and I'm sure that it will go on changing in all sorts of ways, perhaps ways which at the moment we can't even predict. But the NHS is very much part of our culture, unlike the USA, where public health care is viewed with great suspicion. Well, we hope that you'll all have a very interesting evening. We look forward to hearing your questions and the responses from our panellists. If you have a question, please pass it to various people who'll be walking up and down to collect them. And later on, if you want to speak but you don't want to write the question down, then we'll also again have people going around with roving mics so that you are able to be heard by everybody. I'd just like to introduce tonight's panellists. So we have Professor Julian Legrand from the LSE and former advisor to Tony Blair on the NHS. We have Candace Emerson, who's the Deputy Director of Policy at the King's Fund, which is an independent charity which works to improve healthcare in the UK. And we have Andrew Lyles, Chief Executive, Ashford and St Peter's NH Trust. So each of them will say a few words by way of introduction, and then the questions and responses will begin. Oliver Heath is going to chair the discussion. We expect to finish around 7:30, and there will then be a reception in the foyer outside, to which you're all warmly invited. So I hope you all enjoy the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Good evening, everyone, and lovely to see so many of you here. Before we started, I just wanted to ask you all a few questions just to get a sense of the audience that we have. So, how many of you have used an NHS service in the last year, like visiting a hospital or a GP? If you've visited, I'm just back from a recent trip myself. And how many of you work in the health service or in related areas? If you have any sort of professional interest, could you raise your hand? Okay, that's quite a few of you as well. And lastly, how well informed would you say you are about the current round of healthcare reforms? If you feel that you're very well or pretty well informed, could you raise your hand? Okay, so about a third. So hopefully this debate will provide some information at the very least. And I'd like to welcome you to what is really the launch event for the Centre of Social Science at Royal Holloway. The Centre brings together academics working in social science departments across the university, from management, politics and international relations, economics and so on. And the aim is to promote interdisciplinary research, to promote training, but also to try and communicate what goes on here in the university with the outside world, and to create links with members of the public, professional organisations and policymakers. So we'll be running a number of events like this in the future, and I'd urge you to keep an eye on our website and come to any other events that you might find of interest. We're delighted to be participating in the ESRC's Festival of Social Science this year. All this week, up and down the country, there'll be some 200 or so events like this taking place to sort of showcase the relevance of social science research and the different ways in which it can engage and inform in public debate. And these events are a key part of the ESRC initiative that's really to try and bring social science research to the wider world, to the broader population, and to inform but also create a platform for discussion. So the ESRC is one of the largest, or is the largest funder of social science research in Britain. It funds a wide variety of research projects, and we have some promotional material that we've circulated that you can have a look at and take away with you that will give you a better idea of the sort of work that they do. We've also distributed some feedback questionnaires, which we'd be very grateful if you could complete sort of towards the end of the event and hand back to our helpers, which are sort of lurking around the edges, but they'll make themselves known to you. So social science really is about how we can try and understand social, sort of political and economic world around us, how we can understand what happens, why it happens, and what the consequences are likely to be or may be. And where social science research sort of differs from maybe what you'll find in sort of the media is the sort of search for finding sort of valid, reliable, and robust answers to substantively important questions. And it's really to engage with that evidence and how you use that evidence to answer questions that's important. So I'm not sure all social scientists would deliberately sort of break a leg so they could visit their local hospital to get first-hand experience of how the NHS works. But the collection and analysis of data is obviously very important. And it's this that allows us to try and provide questions to important social issues and problems. And that's where today's talk fits in. It's designed to look at the sort of future of the NHS, what the challenges and the risks are with the reform process, and really to try and understand what it means for us as members of the public, taxpayers and patients. And despite the apparent consensus in sort of political circles, at least in England, there's still a lot of controversies and a lot of risks that hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on and provide answers to. So each of the panel members will have sort of 5 minutes or so to sort of set out what they think are the key challenges and issues facing the NHS. And then I'd like to open this up to take questions and to take comments from you in a sort of question time style debate. So if we can sort of keep the questions focused on the issues to really try and understand the reform process and sort of stay away from political grandstanding or personal attacks, certainly none of those, or sort of discussion of individual cases. We can try and get a deeper understanding of the issues and how we can best understand them. So Rosemary's already introduced the panel. I'm very pleased to have such distinguished sort of experts from policy, practitioner, and social science backgrounds. So without further ado, let me pass over to my colleague and co-organiser, Mark Exworthy, from the School of Management here at Royal Holloway.
Thank you, Ollie. I thought it would be helpful just to run through several key issues that are facing the NHS before my panellists give their thoughts and perspectives. So trying to give a reasonably independent and up-to-date set of issues. Broadly speaking, there are three major issues that affect health systems, and the NHS is no different. Demographics, ageing population, technology, a whole range of new applications, new ways of working, and of course rising patient and public expectations. So we're under pressure from external factors before we even start to look at issues such as finance. The NHS is still loved by the British public. It's one of our major institutions. In the British Social Attitude Survey from this year, 88% said that the government should be mainly responsible for paying for the cost of healthcare when someone is ill. And that has risen 6 percentage points within the last 6 years. So we're even more in love with the NHS. On the negative side, public satisfaction, as measured in patient surveys, has fallen sharply since 2010. So we might think that some of the effects of cuts and shortages would be coming to affect individual patient experience. By comparison, the NHS still does very well internationally. We are seen, and this is from a US organisation, the best in terms of patient safety, coordination of care and patient engagement. It may not always feel like that from your point of view, but internationally we still do very well. In terms of finance, the spending has increased as a result of the Blair government meeting the EU average. In fact, we're slightly above the average compared to other countries, spending nearly 10% of our income, so 10% of the whole of everything that is spent in the country, and that equates to about £2,500 for each person. The budget is set to rise this year by 1.3%, but when you factor in inflation, ageing population, etc., it probably feels more like a cut. And on top of that, the government has said by 2015 that 20 billion would be saved. Currently, the budget is about 110 billion a year. So we're looking at quite major cuts. Already some cuts have been felt, particularly in employment. So in the latest figures this year, or for the last year, we've seen a 2% cut in nurses and an 18% cut in managers. And of course, next April, as some of you working in the health service will probably know already, the pay restraint, the freeze on public sector pay, will come to an end. So there was likely to be an upward pressure from there. In terms of what we get, in terms of broad quality measures, waiting lists are much less of an issue than they were 10, 20 years ago. So we might think that's good news. On the other hand, some of these financial cutbacks might lead to greater pressures for that waiting list to rise, and still 8% of patients are waiting more than the target of 18 weeks. A&E has been a particular source of stress, not least perhaps as Andrew might mention. Nationally, the 4-hour target is met, but still 35 trusts have failed to meet that in the latest figures, which is from the second quarter of this year. Hospital cleanliness, infection rates are seen as a public concern in recent years, but this has been a particularly good news story that hasn't hit the headlines, and there's been a 35% fall in the cases of one type of infection just in the last year, between 2011 and 2012. And then just finally, a couple of points. just to add a bit of spice to the debate, possibly, Labour has a 30-point polling lead over the Tories on who's the best party, who has the best policies for healthcare. It might be interesting to follow up that in debate. In terms of a couple of issues that I don't know what my panellists will say, but a couple of issues that might, if they don't, hopefully these might come up. Issues about reorganisations, some of the national reforms that are taking place in reorganisation of reduction in managers, staff, local service changes, reforms to local A&E, hospital closures, particularly in northwest London, and then under the banner of choice and competition, issues around commissioning, GPs taking a much greater lead in commissioning services, and the role of the private sector. Probably at no other point in the history of the NHS has the role of the private sector been greater. But what should be the future? Should that increase? Should that decrease? What sort of role should they play? So there's just a few topics to get you energised and get you thinking, and hopefully that stimulated your thoughts and possibly some of the panellists as well. So just to get their views and perspectives and to help you respond, we'll go through the panellists one by one, just giving a few minutes to offer their thoughts, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers from the floor. So, first of all, I think is Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. So, I thought I'd start by giving you a few vital statistics about my organisation, Ashford and St Peter's Hospital. So, our annual budget is £230 million, which is obviously a big sum of money. But more importantly, the vital statistics around what describes us as a human enterprise. So, in our organisation, which we run 2 hospitals, there are 3,300 staff, 400 volunteers. We come to work every day, 24/7, 365 days of the year, and have 500,000 patient contacts per annum. That's everything from an outpatient appointment, which is the most common thing we do, to 4,300 births per annum, emergency admissions in the middle of the night, a very busy A&E department. So my starting point with organisations like mine is to think of them as human enterprises, and what our staff do every day, I think, is amazing. I think the NHS is one of the best things about our country, that 24/7, 365 days a year, anybody can come and receive good health care at an NHS hospital. The 2 hospitals that we've got Ashford Hospital, which is on the A30 just outside of Staines, which is a rehabilitation and elective hospital, and then we have St Peter's Hospital, which is the biggest of the emergency acute hospitals in Surrey, on junction 11 of the M25. So we spend a lot of time on the M25 in my organisation. So Mark asked me to talk about a few of the challenges at our trust, but actually we're doing okay. So we've been a foundation trust now for 2 years. So most of the audience will know that there's a challenge to hospital organisations to become foundation trusts. It's a big hurdle that you need to jump to show that you're well run, strong finances, good quality plans for the future. And we got there 2 years ago, which means that we now are run in a different way. As well as having a board of directors, we have a council of governors of 26 people made up of elected members of the public, staff and stakeholders, including this university. And this council of governors work alongside the board to give us real-time feedback from staff and patients on how things are going, and also help us steer the organisation forward. And that's becoming an effective and a quite different and more democratic way of running a human enterprise such as ours. And how things are going this year, I mean, you'll know that the health service is very heavily regulated. And we've had 6 unannounced visits from the Care Quality Commission in the past year alone, and we're fully compliant with all of those standards. And we have our own regulator monitor who finds us to be in good financial health and meeting all of the key targets. We're managing, despite the constrained finances, as a foundation trust, to invest in our services. We're doing major refurbishment of an outpatient department at Ashford Hospital, building a new midwifery-led unit at St Peter's Hospital, and we form good relationships with other hospitals and other parts of the system. So, in that respect, the NHS in these more toughened times, you can do well, you can succeed. It's not a fait accompli that you're going to be in some kind of crisis. That certainly isn't how it feels where we are. But clearly we do have some key challenges now and moving forward. And I'd say that the key operational challenge for us is that the number of emergency admissions and emergencies coming to hospitals like ours is increasing. That's contrary to national policy. The NHS should be working to reduce the number of emergencies coming to hospital. But in my trust, so far this year, we've had 8% more emergencies than were planned or funded. That's 1,500 more emergency patients. And the nature of these patients are different. We're noticing, and I think probably more so given the population we serve to other parts of the NHS, is the average age and need of these patients is changing year on year. So the average age at Ashford and St Peter's Hospitals now is 78. And these are elderly patients, often with difficult social circumstances because of a change in their fortunes in their life, dementia, multiple conditions. And it feels sometimes of an evening or a Friday evening that all roads lead to A&E, from nursing homes to GP practices or anywhere. There's a stream of ambulances bringing often frail older people to a hospital. We don't have enough of the alternatives to hospital for older people, despite our best efforts. And what that means in terms of the challenge, that means that we have wards with large numbers of frail older people whom we must give good, compassionate care to. And you all know that there's a real concern nationally now about the care that older people get in hospitals and institutions. And that's a massive focus for my organisation and the board, is how we provide good basic nursing care and compassion to our patients, particularly patients now with a much greater need than would have been in a hospital like mine 5 or 10 years ago. And this increase in emergencies bring quite big financial pressures as well. The national policy for the NHS is to reduce emergency admissions coming into hospitals like ours, and to ensure there's no incentive for us to go out with a net and try and capture some of these to bring them in. We're financially penalised. So this year, the increase in emergency admissions will cost my organisation around £4 million as a financial penalty. So that's a key operational issue for us that we're right in the middle in seeking to survive, but be on the front foot with, and always make sure that we're providing the best care we can to these emergency patients. And then the big strategic issue for us is, you heard from Mark that the NHS is reorganising. By next April, the new NHS, or the new NHS, will be in place with new commissioning arrangements. And they're very important to my organisation. So the commissioners, the people who purchase or fund our services, will fall into 2 categories. There'll be the clinical commissioning group, run by the local general practitioners in North West Surrey. We'll have one that covers the majority of our catchment population, and those GPs, we hope, will be good commissioners who are able to make the system of care work with us so that all roads don't lead to the A&E department, and we're able to develop better systems of care, including in the home, in people's homes and in community hospitals, which will be good for us. But at the same time, they will be encouraged to increase the amount of competition for some of the acute care we provide. So the most common thing we do is we provide outpatient clinics, and the GP commissioners will be looking to set up more of these clinics, some from the private sector, out in the community hospitals to drive competition. So those are 2 competing issues for us as we look forward to new commissioning. And then there's going to be specialist commissioning done nationally, and many of our services, like vascular surgery, cardiology, bariatric surgery, neonatal intensive care, many of the things that we do at St Peter's Hospital for large parts of Surrey are going to be commissioned nationally by this national board. And we know that there's a wave coming of further centralisation of specialist services. So for Ashford and St Peter's Hospitals, it's how we position ourselves and prepare ourselves so that we're a hospital that gets centralised to, rather than away from. So that's a really important strategic issue for us. And then finally, where those two commissioning changes, more care coming out of a hospital and further centralisation means there's a big question for organisations like mine is around what is the future for the District General Hospital. And we all have a sense that over time, because of commissioning, moving some care out of hospital, centralising others, and a continued pressure on finances, that scale is going to be important. And so increasingly organisations are looking at mergers or takeovers to see how they would become bigger through this recession. My organisation has just spent a year coming very close to taking over Epsom Hospital, which would have made us 50% bigger, but we've just pulled out of that arrangement. That arrangement recently stopped because the financial deficit became too hot to handle at this particular time.
Okay. Julian.
Thank you. I think the chief challenge facing the NHS at the moment is to undo the damage caused by the debacle over NHS reforms we've just seen over the past year or two. I expect there are a number of people here who work in the NHS who might well agree with that, but maybe my reasons are a little bit different. Let me explain. If you're confronted with a poorly performing hospital and you're a government minister, say, if you could imagine that you're a Secretary of State for Health, you've got a whole set of poorly performing hospitals, you're likely to find two kinds of, you ask for solutions, you're likely to be offered two kinds of solutions by your civil servants. One lot will come to you and say, look, Minister, the problem is the money. There isn't enough money, and there aren't enough resources, and also there are various structural problems, such as the institutions are too small or they're too large, a variety of factors that basically say, look, just resolve these barriers, resolve this problem, not enough money, various barriers to go. And then, Minister, don't worry, all your problems will be solved. An alternative view is to say, well, incidentally, that was roughly the situation that happened when Blair came into power in 1997, found an NHS creaking at the seams, and was told the answer was really more money, and eventually they did begin to put in more money. It didn't work. Frank Dobson, as you may remember, the Secretary of State for Health at the time, had to go onto television and apologise for the fact that waiting times were actually increasing, despite the fact more money was going in. Basically, it didn't seem to resolve the problem. And that's when Blair actually turned to a second set of civil servants who said, nah, we knew that wasn't going to work. What you've got to apply some external pressure. There's got to be some external pressure. You will simply not get, you can't simply hand the money over and trust the professionals or others to deliver the goods. You've got to have some form of external pressure. And they moved then to actually sort of almost completely the reverse, almost what you might call a mistrust model of public service provision, by which they set targets and engaged in performance management, so-called performance management, to try and get those targets. This performance management rather rapidly became known as targets and terror. The government spent a lot of time essentially terrorising the people who worked in hospitals and rest of it. I expect some of you have experienced the phone call from the Department of Health saying what the hell's going on. I was actually an advisor at the time, and I watched the Prime Minister terrorising the ministers over these things. He would call in the minister, and the minister would come in quivering with his or her civil servants, and the Prime Minister would metaphorically and almost literally on occasions lift up the minister by the scruff of their neck and say, what's going on? Why is your department performing so miserably? I think there were many of us who felt that, yes, external pressure was necessary, but actually that although targets worked, they worked in a crude sense, and there's no doubt they did work, and the NHS met all its targets. I think there were many of us who felt, who were working in government at the time, that actually this wasn't the way to go. It might be quite good as a sort of short, sharp shock, but actually in the long run there was too distortionary, too demoralising to try and run an NHS, a health service of any kind in that way. And that's when we began to advise moving towards a different kind of pressure, which is the pressure from competition. There was a greater encouragement of the process of competition. The independent sector treatment centres were brought in, the foundation trusts were set up to and given independence, and there was a sort of move towards a greater degree of competition within the service. Didn't happen, incidentally, in Scotland and Wales, and I think it's quite interesting to talk about that and see the performance there, which actually has continued not to be very good. In England, actually, the choice in competition, there's quite a lot of research has come out. A recent book by the King's Fund has actually said that the choice of competition model, they didn't work, didn't create enormous changes, but did work in the sense that they did bring about an improvement in the quality of the services being provided, and without causing the massive kind of damage that many people predicted. Then when the Blair government left power, and I would say this, wouldn't I, but when the government left power, in fact, there was a system that was broadly working, it was working quite well. Public satisfaction was the highest it's ever been with the NHS. And then came this dreadful bill. Now, in fact, what the bill was trying to do was quite laudable. It was trying to increase the powers, build on the kind of things that the previous government introduced. Practice-based commissioning, try and turn that into so-called GQ commissioning, increase competition and competitive pressure and so on. But they made the mistake of trying to put this all into legislation. They needn't have done it. They needed to put it into legislation. And in doing so, aroused all the kind of latent opposition to that kind of approach with the consequences we all know. As a result, the bill, I think, has been hobbled in various ways. I'm not sure if it's going to be workable. I mean, it'd be very interesting, and it'd be interesting to see what Andrew's and Candace's view on this. The commissioning groups are going to be accountable in a whole variety of different directions, I mean, to local authorities as well, scrutiny committees, a whole variety of all. They're going to have doctors and nurses on them. There's sort of rather confusion, hospital doctors and nurses on them, or rather confusion at the purchaser-provider split. The regulator has been emasculated and been told not to promote competitive behaviour, but to promote cooperation and so on. And I think that there's going to be real dangers that actually the system will, after a while, will grind to a halt. So that's my view, Kevin, as to what the real challenge facing the system is.
Great.
Right, well, I'm going to try and be very brief because you guys have all had to sit incredibly quiet for a very long time. So I've got 4 key points I want to make. And the first one is about getting the basics right in the NHS. And it's been powerfully influenced by my experience at the moment as a daughter of a mother who's just had a repeated admission to hospital, an unnecessary repeated admission to hospital. And in hospital, we actually had examples of me and my sister having to organise the care she needed for her. It couldn't somehow be something that she could get for herself in the hospital. In sharp contrast to the admission my father had to hospital, the same hospital, a year previously, which was absolutely fabulous from beginning to end. And for me, that speaks to one of the challenges in the NHS is the huge variation that exists within hospitals, within GP practices, within community services. At some ends, fantastic, absolutely superlative care. and there's other care that is really not acceptable. And somehow that variation, the averages don't speak to that variation. And all the work that we do at the King's Fund, time and time again, exposes this scale of variation. I want to underline the importance of money. This has come up, I think, in several of the presentations. The 20 billion that Mark referred to is the difference between what the NHS might have expected to get on its sort of normal growth that it would get in terms of money versus what it will get by 2014-15. The trouble is that that lack of getting real growth money is going to go on, and we think it may go on for about 10 years on current contexts. So that, while Andrew's organisation now may be coping quite well with the financial challenge, and I'm a non-executive director as well as my role at the King's Fund, and the organisation I'm a NED at is coping quite well. Actually, the challenge of saving money, I think, is driving some really good things in the hospital that I'm a NED at. It's driving us to do stuff we should have maybe done a long time ago. But actually, how long can you carry on that productivity? And the chief economist at the King's Fund, John Appleby, questions whether it's a productivity challenge too far. It would amount to about 50 billion if you take it to 2020. The third point is around a new model of care. And I think Andrew, the way he was describing the type of patient that is using his hospital and the scale of growth of use speaks to needing much, much stronger care in primary and community services, having much more integrated care that also is much more closely linked to Andrew's staff, who should be seeing themselves as part of a joint team that works across primary, community and secondary care. And at the moment, organisational barriers, financial barriers, professional barriers all get in the way of that, and people have to work incredibly hard to stitch up the seams between those different services. And to give you some context, Andrew talked about the people with multiple conditions. In 2008, there were 1 million people with multiple conditions. We estimate there will be 2.9 million by 2018. The number of over 85s will double in the next 20 years. The scale of demand is going to keep on growing. We absolutely critically need a new model of care. And I will end on the reforms that Julian talked about. I think that, one could spend all evening talking about the reforms. And I think, as Julian said, I think one of the key challenges for the reforms is the way in which they have now getting to be implemented, with all sorts of inconsistencies within them, which actually make them potentially very challenging to work. And they are a potentially huge distraction at the point at which we absolutely need to be focusing on this money and new model of care issue. I suppose two things that I would flag up as my key concerns. One is just the lack of clarity about who is responsible for what. If you ever look at a situation where something has gone wrong, almost without fail, somebody will say, well, we weren't clear who was responsible for what. And actually, I think that is going to be a huge issue. There's immensely complex lines of accountability. And we've just done a piece of work in London, and we've counted 85 different bodies that are going to play a part in strategic planning in London. So just think about the complexity that that offers up. And in terms of GP commissioning, I have quite mixed views about it. On the one hand, I think there are some phenomenal GP commissioners out there who bring an entirely new perspective, but actually they are taking on a very, very different role to the one they have historically had. The development challenge for them as individuals and for them as organisations is huge. And I think there's a potential risk of them not knowing what they don't know, which actually could hinder their capacity of commissioners. So those are my 4 points.
Thank you very much. Well, some fascinating insights there. I'd like to give you a chance to respond to that, because there's a lot of information. So if you do have a question or a point you'd like to make, please can you raise your hand? Yeah, the gentleman there.
You didn't ask size of organisation, bearing in mind that there's different geographical and demographic factors, but what sort of size organisation can actually work to the benefit of the patients and the service in an effective way without collapsing on itself as many of the big corporations do in certain business?
Andrew, would you like to
That's a really good
respond?
question, a really hard one to answer. And I think what's happening in the NHS is that there are some organisations are becoming huge. So we've seen in London the very big trusts, what we now call academic health science centres, like King's and Guy's and Imperial, are whopping organisations. They have little in common with a traditional general hospital like mine. And then in other cities, like in Bristol, there are two big trusts in Bristol that are in the process of merging, and I think that that's going to be a huge organisation. But the majority of NHS organisations are acute hospitals, which is the world that I come from, are district general hospitals that serve, sometimes paired, like we've got at Ashford and St Peter's, that serve usually a natural community. And the size of the hospital would be determined by the size of the community that it serves. So the job that I had before I moved up to Surrey, I was the chief executive of St Richard's Hospital down in Chichester, a perfectly formed hospital, but with a catchment population of 180,000, and throughout its history it was dogged by people asking, is it big enough? Is it big enough to have an A&E department? So it used to be the thought that 180,000 catchment population to have an A&E department or provide some of the specialist emergency surgery out of hours would be borderline. Nowadays, that's definitely seen to be too small. At Ashford St Peter's, we thought we would be immune from this catchment, size and catchment, because we're quite a big organisation for a general hospital. We've got a catchment population of 400,000, but some of the specialties that are important to us, like cardiology and vascular, now have de minimis catchment populations of 800,000. Last week we had a big external assessment of the vascular centre at St Peter's, and we've passed. But in order to do that, we're going to have to attract patients from the whole of Surrey. So we've got an agreement that we'll network now with other hospitals to provide the vascular services for them. So in organisations like ours, there are key core services that the public hold dear, and we've all got services that are particularly specialist and important to us. An example for ours would be vascular surgery. But in order to maintain those services, they need to serve a catchment population bigger than the current or the natural one for the organisation. So options, if you want to maintain those services, are that you either do that through collaboration and networking, which is what we're doing, or mergers. If you feel you can't make progress like that, you merge or acquire to create a bigger organisation. But I think specialist commissioning of services is going to drive organisations like mine to look for ways that they can increase their scale. But I agree with you in becoming bigger. Mergers come with risk, and bigger organisations lose something that smaller organisations can provide to local communities. So it's a dilemma for us, I think, at the moment.
Thanks.
Could I comment, Chairman? I actually have come hot foot from Bristol, where I am a member of the governing body, and that is not yet done.
Oh, beg your pardon.
Okay. But that is what prompted my question. Right. I mean, the prospect of the city and county having one
huge trust
group presents enormous challenges.
So would you like to follow that up?
Well, indeed, I was on the board of a previous hospital merger in Bristol between Frenchay and Southmead hospitals. I was on the board of Frenchay at the time and deeply opposed the merger. And the result was, in the end, the North Bristol Trust, which I think a few years later posted the largest deficit in NHS history. I think the tendency, you're absolutely right to draw attention to it. I think the merger mania that we're seeing is disastrous. I think it's going to create very large monopolistic bureaucratic organisations that are going to effectively have a monopoly in their area. And I have to say, I think the particular merger in Bristol, is a really serious mistake. if it ever does come on. Although there is a case for having a moderate-sized hospital, particularly for specialist areas, you've got to have people with sufficient experience, surgeons, consultants with sufficient experience to be able to deliver high-quality services. But the kind of scale that we're seeing of merger is, I think, in many cases going to lead to a far worse service rather than a better one.
Candace, I wondered if you could follow up. Is there a relationship maybe between the size of a hospital and the sort of variation that you were talking about in terms of the service that it delivers?
Not a clear one, actually. And interestingly, the evidence around critical mass that is needed for clinical quality is confined to a relatively few specialties. And certainly when it comes to general medicine, you actually need a relatively low level of activity to be safely able to deliver that. There is evidence around diseconomies of scale, though, in hospitals, but it's relatively outdated. It was done by York back circa 2000-ish. And they showed that once you got more than 600 hospital beds, then you started to move into diseconomies of scale. There's a massive evidence about the challenges of mergers in any sector. Health is not the only one who suffers from it, because they tend to go in with unclear objectives and lack of clarity about how those objectives are going to be achieved. So it's perhaps not surprising they don't always get to them.
Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to make two points. There's been some very good social science research about the effects of mergers, and broadly speaking, it disrupts the organisation for about 18 months to 2 years. So at a time when, as Candace said, we should be getting the basics right, merger is a distraction that perhaps could be done without. That said, there might be some benefits in terms of some of the clinical evidence suggests that larger organisations tend to perform better in particular specialties, so that could be good. But the issue of local access has still got to be addressed, and particularly public opposition. So Andrew mentioned the Chichester Hospital, huge opposition to changes, closure of the A&E, and we're seeing that in northwest London, particularly in Ealing Hospital as well. So it might be a good clinical case to be made, but it's going to have to come up against the kind of public outcry of a loss of access.
Great. We'll take some more questions. The chap in the check shirt. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, just to stay on the subject of A&E closures, a bit, to add some statistic to that, you've got three London boroughs, northwest London boroughs, all losing their A&Es, so that's a total population of 750,000 people losing their A&Es, just to put that into some context. And my question is kind of directed to Andrew, leaning onto that. Kind of, you're talking about the number of admissions in A&E in kind of a supply and demand context, which is not only disingenuous, but strikes me as very dangerous as well. Surely, call me maybe academically and economically naive for saying so, but do we not have a humanitarian responsibility first, and then the financial responsibility is a second after that? And if there's too much constraint on the NHS Trust budget as a result, surely doesn't the NHS Trust then have a responsibility to lobby the government for more money? I think the NHS Trust has some important decisions to make. Does it represent the public interest and provide a good healthcare service for the public? Because the NHS, it doesn't matter if it's symbolically publicly funded, if it's not providing the service to the public, or does it just simply go be basically a yes man to government, to corporations, etc.?
What is it that you feel that we're not doing?
As someone from the outside, I don't think that you're necessarily representing the public's best interests. I think you give in too easily to government, to corporations, and you don't lobby enough for more funding. Because obviously, in terms of the North West London case, the NHS Trust justification is that they're getting a lack of funding for the government, so services do have to be cut, like the A&Es, etc. I think the NHS Trust has to kind of be more vociferous in its response to that to the government and lobby for more funding. Kind of say, for example, in the North West London case, I think it's near on 90% public support against it. I think they do have to represent that public. And
I guess my job is to make the health service work. And in my organisation, our A&E department isn't under threat. It's too busy at times, and that can cause financial pressures. But we provide good 24/7 A&E services. Everybody gets admitted to our hospital. It causes financial pressures, but we manage the organisation in a way that we meet all our financial targets this year. So I don't, apart from me chaining myself to the front of the hospital and demanding more money for the NHS, which I don't think would be particularly, be particularly effective. I'm not quite sure what it is you feel that we're not doing right at Ashford St Peters.
I suppose there's a larger question that comes back to the issue you were raising earlier about the financial penalties that you were receiving for taking in more A&E patients than the sort of target that you had been set, and then what impact that kind of strategy has on the sort of service that you deliver.
So it means that we have to create more savings across the organisation in order to meet our financial targets, and that's the case for all of the acute hospitals in the country. And the reason that the financial penalties were brought in to rising emergency admissions to the NHS, I think next year will be the fourth year, was because in the NHS, one of the biggest growth areas are increasing emergency admissions to hospitals like mine, and we traditionally were paid based on the numbers of patients that we treated. And so the biggest increase in income in NHS organisations was linked to the rise in emergency admissions, which meant all the money was going into organisations like mine, and the diagnosis was, and I would agree, many of the patients that come as an emergency would be better treated at home or in a community hospital, but there hadn't been investment in those. So we kind of got ourselves into a checkmated position. All the money was coming into the hospital sector, and there wasn't investment in the alternatives, and that's why this penalty, this financial penalty, was introduced. I mean, the organisation that represents foundation trusts is lobbying hard now for a change in that policy, because 3 or 4 years on, it's cost a lot of money. It's added a lot of financial pressure into the acute sector, and we still haven't seen the investment in community services.
Julian, do you know if, do financial penalties work in that sense? I mean, are they an important part of competition?
As I think I've already indicated, I don't believe the answer is more money in various ways. I think the point about corporations was interesting, that you were arguing that the corporations are in some way keeping down the amount of money to be spent on the NHS. I think the truth is actually quite the reverse, that and particularly one particular sector of the industrial sector in the UK argues very strongly for an increase in the amount of money spent on the NHS, and that's the pharmaceutical industry. Extremely powerful lobby, continuously, as I note in my costs, continuously lobbying government in one form or another to try and get more money spent on drugs in one way. And I think that's, in fact, that is in some sense symbolic of the real danger of enormous pressure to spend more money. That the money will be spent in ways that are as inefficient and ineffective and on the wrong sort of drugs. So I think what we actually need are better incentives for efficiency and productivity within the NHS rather than necessarily more money.
I'll try and get a few more questions in, so perhaps we can take sort of 3 or 4 at a time. So start with you, and then come there, and then there, and then there. Okay?
Thanks for that. I think the fundamental question is, NHS been set so long time ago that it's focusing on hospital care. So I find it really ridiculous, the fact that every single hospital are doing cost cutting, and it's like, yeah, within the organisation wouldn't do that. But actually, you are servicing the public. You should actually negotiate liaison with the local authority to get the social care right, to actually get your long-term care right, and to get your acute primary trust care right. Because at the end of the day, you want to reduce the amount of A&E admission in a way. Actually, quite a lot of things can be done outside the community that, because of this fermented local government structure, or actually just the whole UK structure, how it's worked at the moment, then it makes it, you spend much more money on actual acute care in your trust itself, but actually not spending money in the place that you're meant to be spending. And isn't that you should be more focusing to get down to the root of the cause of, because the community, the local authority, or even the government is not doing the right thing, to not just focusing on NHS itself, because it should be, social housing should be dealing with something like that, and then the NHS dealing with something like that, and also GP should have responsibility doing something like that. So it's a collaborative effort, not just like NHS being the cost cutting, so we drive this service out and things like that. So what do you think as a panelist that what you guys not doing things right to look into the future, because the aging population is not going to go away? Okay, and I think that's the question that I would like to ask all the panelists.
Okay, we'll try and get a few more questions in, and then the panelists can respond to all of them.
I want to talk about the bigger picture of the overall shift towards privatised contracting. We've heard about pharmaceutical companies, but the whole contracting thing is much bigger than that. And we talk about the NHS as a national issue. All of the debate is at the national level, but that push for that push for transnational investor access to public procurement is a global push. Like there's a global procurement agreement at the WTO level. It's a global push for transnational corporate investors to get not just access to public procurement globally, but rights to access it as well. The international trade agenda, which is the framework for all domestic policy, gets no attention in this country, but there's actually a US-EU free trade agreement being lined up, commencing in the new year, and the last 2 years has been a preliminary harmonisation towards that. And in Brussels it was discussed 2 years ago that the first harmonisation would be in health. And for the last 2 years, have we been preparing the NHS for US mega corporation transnational investment? It seems like that. And how do we get that bigger picture into the public sphere?
I'll give the chance to answer that, but I just wanted to get a few more points and questions in. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Several on the panel mentioned tonight the term competition, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the evidence, the relationship between increased competition on specifically 2 points. One is better value healthcare for patients, and secondly, the relationship, including trust relationships between healthcare professionals and patients. So what's the relationship that with increased competition, and how does that affect, how does increased competition affect those 2 points, value and trust?
Thank you. And just squeeze one last one in.
Is there any scope for directly elected health NHS commissioners?
Okay. Thank you. Mark, do you want to tackle some of those issues?
I'll tackle some of them. The first question about the focus on hospital care links quite nicely with the previous one. The NHS is traditionally seen as a health service, but quite often it's about the ill health service. So there's a danger that we spend 90% of our money in acute secondary care and 10% in primary care, and yet the contacts, the patient contacts, is 90% in primary care and about 10%. That's a very broad scope. So in some ways, a lot of work, as Andrew was alluding to, could be prevented in secondary care by stronger, better quality primary care. But that's been a long-term agenda, and a lot of the interest nationally, we heard about hospital closures, is on the hospital. The hospital is the physical manifestation, if you like, of our NHS. So changing that model is extremely difficult organisationally and politically and financially. So it might be a good thing, and I would agree with that sentiment, but achieving that, implementing that is extremely difficult. Not just in the current context, I'm thinking over most of the NHS. To pick up on the last one, I can't probably answer all four without squeezing the time of the others. A directly elected health commissioner, well, in some ways we're starting to think about that or experiment with that. Public health has moved into the local government sector out of health. It certainly happens in other countries, and in some ways that would advance the localism agenda of this government quite strongly. It could reveal some vested interests in the way that police commissioners, which will be elected next week, might reveal as well. Most of those tend to be party political candidates, which might lead to, on the one hand, better engagement with the public, but equally some stronger local politics and some of the downsides of that. So I think there's some merit in it, but I'd be cautious about it.
Candice.
Gosh, where do I begin?
International financial
No, definitely not. I mean, I think, well, my take on the where and how competition may play out is none of us really know. And it's also, I think, a very important point around competition is different types of services have different evidence bases to suggest that competition works to a greater or better, lesser extent. So if you take the full-scale A&E service, there is not great evidence that that would be susceptible to good competition. You basically have huge barriers to entry in that sort of market. It just is not very susceptible to it. But there are other types of services, actually GP services, where you could argue that maybe competition would be a good thing. There's also, do you compete for the market, which is in effect what happened for the stroke services in London, which produced fabulous effects. So hospitals had to compete in order to deliver those stroke services, or do you compete within the market when you may get some unintended consequences, some adverse consequences from it? And the evidence, as I understand it, and Julian will be a much better expert on this than me, is hotly contested around competition. So there are people who believe absolutely vehemently that it is fabulous and will demonstrate, bring out their studies to support it, and others who believe equally in the other direction and will try to undermine those studies. And in fact, I think a new study has just come out that is showing that depending on how you measure it, then you can say competition has delivered good or bad things. So there you go.
Julian, would you like to follow up on that?
The evidence to which I was referring was about value for money, or rather more accurately, it was about it was looking at the impact of competition on various indicators of outcomes, particularly deaths from AMI, and looking at post-operative mortality rates in many ways. And what it found was that controlling for everything else, that areas in more competitive areas tended to did do rather better on those measures than others. I think the impact on trust, I think, is a very interesting one. I think there's always a question about the factors that impact on the trust between a patient and the doctor. One of the, I remember when we were thinking about the GP commissioning when I was working in government, and thinking about the question of whether hospitals should be allowed to compete on price as well as on quality. And we thought, well, if there was some evidence actually suggesting if you did get competition on price, it actually worsened quality. But also, we thought, well, if the GP is referring a patient on to a hospital, if the patient begins to think that the reason why they're being transferred onto that hospital is because it's cheaper, you've really got a problem. An erosion, a significant erosion of trust, which is one of the reasons why we decided actually to have prices the same across the health service, to have the so-called payment by result system, where you actually have, where you don't allow competition on price, you only have competition on quality. On the case of the US, the evil American corporation coming in to destroy a health service, I suppose this is a scare that is brought up periodically, and every so often you do get a small invasion of an American corporation or two, and not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there are some corporations, I think, could probably do an excellent job of running our hospitals. I would quite like to see Apple investing to run some of our hospitals. But it is actually, there already is a very substantial degree of private sector involvement of different kinds in the health service. GPs, of course, are all private. They are private profit-maximising partnerships. I think it's something like 35% of mental health services of secure mental health services are provided by the private sector. There is, of course, also the pharmaceutical industry. I think that privatisation is, in a sense, already here. I think the trick is just to make sure that it doesn't have the downsides that many people feel that privatisation have, and that we can reap some of the benefits and the increased competition that it provides.
Andrew, briefly, would you like to see elected healthcare officials? How is that? No.
But I don't know why. But can I come back on to just quickly come back on the... I think the point you make around systems and all the authorities coming together in an area is exactly right. It's what we're trying to do. It's what Candace described in terms of this new model of care. It's what I described in terms of what we hope, where we hope to get in North West Surrey by working with GPs as commissioners. Because you're right, we have to, all of the agencies in different parts of the system have to work and come together so that we can care for particularly the ageing population, the emergencies, in a different way from them all coming to hospital. So we know that. It's just that we haven't yet fixed it, but it is the top of the list of things to do. In terms of competition, there's actually, in my experience in the NHS, there's much more collaboration than there is competition. So in West Surrey there are 3 foundation trusts, and although we all watch the Woking GPs intently, because the Woking GPs can refer to any swing 3 of us, so it's like the Woking is our swing state for GP referrals. Actually, that's really marginal. We spend much more time having clinical networks between the 3 foundation trusts. We've just joined up all of our pathology services. So although there's a degree of competition, there's much more collaboration happens between, in my experience, between NHS organisations. Of course, the thing that you don't want is you don't want private sector competition within your traditional catchment population, because the private sector wouldn't come into North West Surrey wanting to set up an A&E department to help us out on a Friday evening with the emergencies. They'll want to do the more simple elective work, which is the area that we do make a profit on in order to fund the A&E service. So the default position I find with NHS organisations is to collaborate, but private sector competition in your backyard can now be quite dangerous given the financial challenges we face.
Okay, I think we're nearly out of time, so I'll just do a quick sort of tour around the room for sort of last comments. The lady in the back row. Yeah. You.
I have, first of all, one question, and the second one is just a point of contrast I'd like to make. First question is, if any of the panelists have any figures for how reliant the NHS organisations, probably Mr. Andrew, might have just how reliant on donations are you at the moment? And the second one is just if we take, for example, Cuba's healthcare service. I mean, Professor Julian mentioned that it's not an issue of money. And I mean, if we compare it to, for example, Cuba, which is not particularly well off, what kind of improvements would the NHS possibly think of in, well, making its way out of the current situation without needing any further, money input?
Thank you. And the gentleman in the back row.
For the last 30 years, I've lived just across the road here and in central Scotland. Can I ask a question which I wouldn't be asking in Scotland? And that is, these days with GPs, are the 40s the new 50s?
New 50s. Okay, last. Okay, so let's round down here.
It's a question about the clinical commissioning groups. Do you think that this is likely to increase the postcode lottery?
Okay, thank you. And last question. Yeah.
I think Andrew was getting close to it. It seems to me that the health service is multi-layered. There are all sorts of different activities from walk-in centres, accident emergency, GPs, and they all have different cost structures. And what you've got to do is to stop people getting into the most expensive area of cost and keep them at the lower level of cost. And the local authorities are probably in this as well, because they should be keeping people in better accommodation and making provision for older people to be accommodated in care homes. If you could sort that lot out, then you could bring the cost down, because you keep people out of the expensive areas.
Okay. Let me just quickly, if we can answer one question each. Julian, should we be looking to Cuba rather than the United States as a model for healthcare?
Well, I think Cuba's very interesting, and I visited it, in fact, seen the sort of things they do. I mean, basically, what their health service demonstrates is that if you're prepared to concentrate on one or two things, so infant mortality is a big thing they concentrate on, and put the resources in, yes, it will make a difference. It's not wholly unlike the system that we had, as I mentioned earlier, the targets and performance management system. I mean, it's a command and control system with the pressure comes from the top to try and improve things. I think that, for reasons I've indicated, I don't think at the end of the day, actually, that provides, that is a solution to a highly complex health service with a variety of different cost structures, among other things, but a whole variety, enormous variety of different activities. And the command and control works well when you've got a simple target and you put your efforts into achieving that target. It doesn't work well when you've got a massively complex system with an enormous variety of different outcomes and outputs, and you're trying to increase both the equity and the efficiency of that system.
Okay. Candice, 40s are the new 50s?
Well, if I understood the question, I don't understand what it is, I have to say. What was your... I didn't quite understand what you were getting at with the 40s being the new 50s.
What's the general feeling of people being very stressed? Very stressed. Compared with Scotland, you just go down the road and it's sort of very gentle, but down here it's totally... Well, you've got an impression that on firefighters, which you certainly don't get in Perth, it's just very, very different. And more mistakes being made and this kind of thing, you're more likely to get the best out of the younger people and the registrars and the locals. But as it goes on in time, tremendous sense of just sheer stress, really. You think, these people, they need either to move to central Scotland or to have a bit of
an observation, perhaps, more than a question. Is there anything you'd like to pick up on quickly?
Well, I'll pick up maybe on CCGs in postcode lottery. So, in theory, CCGs should be commissioning according actually to guidance that will come down from the NHS commissioning board, and indeed according to guidance set out by NICE. But my suspicion is that it will potentially sort of exacerbate differences because necessarily CCGs will have their own local pet interests, would be my expectation, and will pursue those. But already, as I was getting at right at the outset, there is a massive postcode lottery in this country, and it sits behind actually some of the issues around A&E services. Do not think that every A&E service has the same service behind it. You can go to one A&E and you will find some junior doctors, and you won't have 24/7 diagnostics, and you won't have 24/7 consultant cover. You go to another A&E and you will find all of those things, and you will get much better care as a result of it, and that sits behind some of the decisions that are being made behind A&E services.
Okay.
I had a question about charitable funds. So we're fortunate that we get donations and support charitably to the Trust. So I think at the moment, probably in our charitable accounts, we'd have around £750,000 to £1 million sat on account. None of that goes to we don't use any of that to fund NHS care. It's all used to enhance and either enhance training courses for staff, or additional facilities, or improving the environment for patients.
And Mark, if you'd like to have the last word.
Yes, I think it's quite interesting to get a gauge of the sorts of questions that have come up this evening. We didn't quite know what would come up, but broadly speaking, that you've covered many of the topics that we had roughly in our mind. So that's really important, and hopefully the event has tried to fill in some of the gaps of knowledge, give you a better idea about what's happening, because 2/3 of the public in a recent poll said they knew nothing or very little about the NHS reform. So if we have done anything, hopefully we have reduced that percentage by a few points, at least in the Surrey neighbourhood. So it leaves me to say thank you to you for coming, but also thank you to the panellists here this evening, and hopefully it's also stimulated your interest in some of the issues and some of the research projects that we've been undertaking here. So follow our progress on the website, and as they say, join in the conversation if you can. But thank you for your participation.
Please join us for refreshments outside and hand in your questionnaires. So thank you.
Just 5 minutes. Thank you.